The rain fell in fine silvery threads across Oxford in the spring of 1939. Inside a dimly lit room of St. John's College, a young mathematician named John Herivel sat hunched over a cluttered desk, his fingertips stained with ink, his mind spiraling through the logic of ciphers and symmetry. At 21, he was not the sort of man who sought glory. He was slight, soft-spoken, with the nervous intelligence of someone who preferred equations to conversation. Yet beneath his quiet manner was a restless curiosity, the kind that turned chaos into structure. Numbers to him were not symbols. They were stories waiting to be told. War was not yet declared, but it loomed. The radio spoke in uneasy tones about Hitler's aggression. Rumors whispered through the corridors of Oxford. The government was quietly assembling a team of mathematicians and linguists for some secret purpose. One afternoon, as Herivel was drafting a paper on mechanical computation, a letter arrived with a red wax seal and a simple heading: The Foreign Office. Mr. Herivel, we would like to discuss your availability for a confidential position of national importance. Please attend a meeting at the Government Code and Cipher School, London. He had no idea what it meant, but 2 weeks later, John found himself stepping off a train at Bletchley Station, suitcase in hand, walking toward a quiet estate surrounded by hedges and secrecy. The air smelled of damp earth and coal smoke. Guards with clipboards checked his name and ushered him through a set of wooden gates. Ahead stood Bletchley Park, a sprawling Victorian mansion repurposed for war. Inside, the corridors buzzed with typewriters and the low murmur of voices. Scholars, chess champions, crossword prodigies, all drafted into a war of intellect rather than guns. Herivel was assigned to Hut 6, a narrow wooden building that smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke. Its windows were taped against shrapnel. Inside, young men and women huddled over intercepted German messages, strings of random letters that meant life or death. "We're trying to break the Enigma," said Gordon Welchman, his superior, with a faint smile. "You'll hear that word a lot. It's the German cipher machine. Changes its settings every 24 hours. Millions of combinations. Practically unbreakable." Herivel nodded, though he barely understood. He was shown to a desk beside a young Alan Turing, brilliant, eccentric, aloof, who scribbled furiously in notebooks filled with impossible diagrams. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and grueling. The Enigma messages poured in by the hundreds, intercepted by wireless operators across Britain. Each day began with coffee, silence, and pages of jumbled letters. Each night ended in exhaustion, but Herivel watched patterns. He noticed quirks, human habits behind the machine. German operators were supposed to randomize their Enigma settings each morning. But humans, Herivel realized, were lazy creatures. They had routines, small comforts, habits, and habits could be predicted. Late one night, as the others left for dinner, John lingered in the hut. Outside, the blackout curtains glowed faintly with the last light of day. He leaned over the Enigma diagrams and whispered to himself, "What if they're setting the wheels before the first message? The same way each time? Out of convenience?" He scribbled down an idea, a hypothesis that seemed almost too naive. If one could guess the operator's initial settings, their mental shortcuts, one could narrow the infinite possibilities. It was, he knew, not a mathematical solution but a psychological one. The war might be won not by logic, but by understanding the human mind behind the machine. The next morning, he nervously presented his theory to Welchman. The older man listened, thoughtful, skeptical. "So you're saying, John, that we might find the key not by brute force, but by empathy?" "By habit," John replied softly. "If we can guess what they do at dawn." Welchman smiled faintly. "Then let's see if your hunch holds, Mr. Herivel." It would become known, years later, as the Herivel Tip, one of the earliest breakthroughs against the Enigma. But in that moment, it was just an idea scribbled in the margins of a notebook by a shy young man in a drafty hut, unaware that his quiet observation might save thousands of lives. Winter had come to Bletchley Park. Frost clung to the edges of the window panes, and the huts creaked in the cold wind that swept across the Buckinghamshire fields. Inside Hut 6, The smell of damp wool, coffee, and cigarette smoke hung heavy. The young men and women hunched over intercepted Enigma messages, wrapped scarves around their necks, the only warmth coming from small electric heaters that buzzed uncertainly. It had been weeks since John Herivel proposed his idea, his tip. Some dismissed it as fanciful, others as the desperate hope of an overworked mind. But Gordon Welchman, pragmatic and brilliant, had quietly begun testing it. Each morning, before the first trains brought the latest batch of Luftwaffe intercepts, Welchman and his analysts tried to reconstruct how a German operator might have set his Enigma machine at dawn. They imagined him sitting in a drafty bunker in France or Belgium, perhaps tired, rushing through the morning procedure. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. In mid-February 1940, Welchman burst into the hut with a sheaf of printouts. His spectacles glinted with excitement. "John," he said, voice trembling slightly, "we think your method worked." Herivel blinked, hardly daring to speak. "Worked?" "Yes. We ran your Herivel Tip on yesterday's Luftwaffe intercepts. We found a match, partial but real. The wheel settings were close to what you predicted." Turing, who rarely showed enthusiasm for anything other than pure mathematics, looked up from his desk, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Congratulations, Herivel," he murmured. "You've found the first crack in the armor." The hut erupted in restrained applause, a kind of subdued British cheer. No one shouted or laughed. They simply exchanged nods, eyes bright with the realization that something had shifted. The war was still young, but the Codebreakers had found their first real weapon. By spring, the Herivel Tip was saving lives. RAF pilots received more accurate intelligence about German raids. The Royal Navy began to anticipate U-boat positions. It was not a full victory, not yet. But it was hope. Still, for John, victory felt hollow. He was working 15-hour days, surviving on weak tea and cigarettes. His hands trembled from exhaustion. At night, when he lay in his narrow bunk at the park's cramped quarters, he could still hear the rhythmic click, click, click of the Enigma wheels in his dreams. Sometimes he wondered whether he had become a machine himself, translating the psychology of the enemy into probabilities, all while losing touch with his own humanity. One evening, as the blackout sirens wailed over Buckinghamshire, John stepped outside the hut. The air smelled of ozone and smoke. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky in the distance. German bombers were passing overhead on their way to London. Alan Turing joined him, coat collar turned up, face pale in the moonlight. "Do you ever feel," Turing said quietly, "that we're breaking more than codes?" John frowned. "What do you mean?" "We listen, we pry. Every message we break means someone's plan has failed, someone's life will end. Sometimes I wonder if morality is another cipher we'll never solve." Herivel had no answer. The wind carried the distant thud of bombs on the horizon. "If it saves even one city," John said finally, "then we do what we must." Turing nodded, though his eyes stayed distant. The work grew faster, more mechanized. Welchman and Turing were building machines now, great whirring behemoths of wires and rotors called bombs, designed to automate the logic of decryption. But it all began with that psychological insight, the Herivel Tip, that had given them the first foothold. By mid-1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, the decrypts from Hut 6 became vital. Every day, Herivel's team reconstructed Luftwaffe commands, often hours before the German squadrons even crossed the Channel. RAF squadrons scrambled in perfect anticipation. Yet the pressure crushed the young mathematician. He started missing meals, forgetting dates, losing sense of day and night. His colleagues whispered that he had the Bletchley stare, that hollow, exhausted gaze shared by those who stared too long at ciphers. Then came the breakdown. It was July 1940. The summer heat turned the huts into ovens. Herivel was poring over messages when his pencil suddenly snapped. He froze, staring at the broken lead as if it were the world itself shattering. Then, without a word, he stood up, stumbled outside, and collapsed on the grass. Welchman found him hours later, sitting in the shadow of a tree, eyes unfocused. I can't," "I can't see it anymore," John murmured. "The patterns are gone." Welchman crouched beside him, voice soft. "You've done enough for now, John. Go home. Rest. You've given us something invaluable." Herivel was reluctant to leave, but within days he was sent away from Bletchley Park to recover. First to Oxford, then to his family home in Belfast. He spent weeks in silence, watching the rain streak down the windows, the same way it had the day he first arrived. He would never return to Hut 6. Others took over, expanding on his ideas, turning intuition into machinery. Turing's bombs would break the Enigma completely within a year. The Codebreakers' triumph became one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets. And John Herivel's name faded into the background, buried under layers of classification and time. Decades later, when the veil of secrecy was finally lifted in the 1970s, historians uncovered fragments of the old records. Among the names of great minds, Turing, Welchman, Knox, appeared a small note in the margins. Herivel Tip, initial operator setting method, crucial in early Enigma breaks. A footnote in history. Yet to those who knew, it was clear, without that one quiet, nervous young man who had dared to see human weakness as the key to machine perfection, the war might have dragged on far longer. He was the forgotten codebreaker, the boy who saw patterns not in machines, but in people. The war ended with a silence John Herivel could not comprehend. After years of decoding terror and tragedy, the quiet seemed unnatural, like a machine suddenly switched off. He was 30, but his eyes looked far older. No medals, no recognition, just a sealed document marked Classified Official Secrets Act. Even his family knew nothing. When they asked what he had done during the war, he'd smile faintly and say, "Oh, just office work for the government." In truth, he had helped shorten the war by years. But the codebreakers of Bletchley Park had all taken an oath of silence. The world moved on without them. In 1946, John returned to Cambridge to complete his degree. He tried to bury himself in academia, lectures, research papers, the quiet discipline of mathematics. But the ghosts of Hut 6 lingered. Every time he saw a typewriter, he thought of the Enigma. Every time he heard the static of a radio, he remembered intercepts carrying the voices of dying pilots and frantic orders. Sleep was no relief. He would wake in the night, heart pounding, hearing phantom clicks, the same mechanical rhythm that had haunted him in the huts. The doctor called it nervous exhaustion. Today we'd call it trauma, but in post-war Britain no one spoke of such things. Men simply got on with it. One foggy afternoon in 1947, John received a letter stamped Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. He hesitated before opening it. Inside, a short, formal note. "Dear Mr. Herivel, we would like to extend our gratitude for your contribution to the war effort. While the nature of your work must remain confidential, the department recognizes the significance of your early insights into Enigma operations. Yours sincerely." Commander Alistair Denniston Herivel stared at the paper. It was polite, bureaucratic, and utterly hollow. No mention of the sleepless nights. No acknowledgement of the breakdowns. No recognition of the thousands of lives saved through his small, brilliant intuition. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke of it again. In the 1950s, as Britain rebuilt, Bletchley Park was forgotten. The huts decayed. The machines were dismantled or buried in classified archives. Alan Turing died in 1954, a quiet tragedy that the newspapers barely covered. Herivel read about it in the Manchester Guardian. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at the print until it blurred. "He saved the world," John whispered, "and they destroyed him." He wanted to scream, to tell the world what Turing had done, what they all had done. But the Official Secrets Act still held him silent. So he returned to his work, teaching physics at Queen's University in Belfast. He taught young minds about motion, entropy, and the beauty of logic, never once mentioning the war. But sometimes, when a student stayed after class and asked about probability, John's eyes would flicker with something unspoken. It wasn't until 1975, 3 decades after the war, that the first books about Bletchley Park were published. The government finally declassified fragments of the operation. Herivel was astonished to see the story in print. He bought a copy of The Ultra-Secret by Frederick Winterbotham and read it cover to cover. But his name wasn't there, nor Turing's full credit, nor the Herivel Tip history, it seemed, had been written by those who shouted loudest, not by those who worked in silence. It wasn't bitterness that drove him next, but duty. In 1978, John Herivel sat at his desk and began to write his own memoir, a quiet, precise recollection of his time at Bletchley Park. He wrote about Welchman's leadership, Turing's eccentric brilliance, Knox's compassion, and the fragile, sleepless camaraderie that bound them together. But above all, he wrote about the human side of codebreaking, how emotion, intuition, and imagination had cracked a machine that was supposed to be unbreakable. The book, titled Herivelismus and the German Military Enigma, was published in 2008, shortly before his death. It was not a bestseller, but historians recognized it as a priceless first-hand account, a bridge between the myth of Bletchley Park and the truth. In his later life, Herivel grew reclusive. He rarely granted interviews, though journalists occasionally sought him out after Enigma became a cultural fascination in the 1990s. He would sit by the fire, tea in hand, and listen to them describe what they thought happened at Bletchley Park. Then, with a faint smile, he would correct a detail or two, never boasting, never dramatizing. "We were ordinary people," he once said softly, "doing an extraordinary job under impossible conditions. And somehow, we won." He passed away in 2011, aged 92. When the obituaries appeared, they were short, respectful, understated, just as he would have wanted. But in the archives of British intelligence, among dusty folders stamped top secret, one note remains beside his name, Herivel. John William, the first to see the human flaw in the Enigma system. Contribution, critical. It was the winter of 1996 when Bletchley Park opened its gates to the public for the first time. The old manor stood like a relic of another age. Ivy crawling up its brick walls, windows clouded with dust, and the faint echo of typewriters lingering in the still air. Visitors came with cameras, historians came with notebooks, and cryptographers came with reverence. But somewhere among the names engraved in plaques and exhibitions, one was missing. His insight, the Herivel Tip, was a footnote at best, a line buried in technical appendices of declassified reports. And yet without it, Bletchley's early breakthroughs against the Luftwaffe's Enigma might never have happened. Dr. Ralph Erskine, a historian of intelligence, was one of the first to notice the omission. While studying declassified GCHQ documents at Kew Archives, he found Herivel's name repeated across pages, scribbled in the margins, often beside the earliest decrypted messages from Hut 6. Erskine called a colleague in Belfast. "I think we've overlooked someone rather important," he said. That call sparked what would become a quiet historical rescue mission. Erskine contacted Queen's University, where Herivel had once taught physics. The archivist there confirmed it. John William Herivel, lecturer, 1948-1978. A few weeks later, Erskine received a small parcel. Inside was a worn notebook wrapped in brown paper, its pages yellowed with age. On the first page, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Notes on the probable habits of German cipher clerks. J.W. Herivel, 1940. Erskine realized what he was holding, the original seed of the Herivel Tip. In the early days of the war, Enigma operators were human. Lazy, frightened, superstitious. Herivel had understood that. He theorized that many German clerks, rushing their morning setup, would fail to randomize their starting positions on the machine's rotors. They would choose settings close to the previous days, or even reuse parts of it, out of habit. It was a psychological weakness, not a mechanical one. That intuition allowed the analysts at Bletchley to guess the Enigma's daily key before the intercepts were even fully processed. It was genius born not from mathematics, but from empathy. And that was what Herivel had always said. To break a machine, you must first understand the mind of the man who built it. Erskine's discovery reignited the conversation about Bletchley's lesser-known heroes. Papers were published, interviews were requested, and one evening in 1999, a BBC crew arrived at Herivel's modest home in Belfast to film a segment for a documentary titled The Real Codebreakers. The camera focused on his face, deeply lined, eyes gentle, but tired. Behind him, shelves overflowed with books. Hardy on numbers, Knuth on algorithms, and a small framed photo of Alan Turing, smiling awkwardly at a garden party. The interviewer asked, "Mr. Herivel, do you think your work has been forgotten?" Herivel chuckled softly. "Not forgotten, just misplaced. History has many filing cabinets. Some drawers open later than others." When asked about his feelings toward Turing, Welchman, and Knox, his tone turned wistful. "They were giants. I was just a lad who made a lucky guess. But that's how war works, a chain of small guesses that somehow end up saving lives." The interview aired that winter. For the first time, the public heard the name John Herivel, spoken alongside Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, not as an afterthought, but as part of the foundation. In the decades that followed, Herivel's papers became vital to the history of computer science and cryptanalysis. His original sketches and notes are now kept in the National Museum of Computing, displayed beside a restored Enigma and a working replica of the bomb. Visitors lean close to read his small, neat handwriting. "Humans make patterns. Machines repeat them. The flaw is always in the human heart." It's a line that resonates deeply in the age of artificial intelligence and data encryption, a reminder that even in the most logical systems, emotion leaves fingerprints. When Herivel died in 2011, the flags at Bletchley Park were lowered to half-mast. Former codebreakers, historians, and cryptologists gathered in the main hall, now fully restored. Dr. Erskine gave a short eulogy. "He was the man who taught us that logic alone cannot win wars. Intuition must walk beside it." They placed his photograph beside the others, Turing, Welchman, Knox, Alexander, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. And in the quiet of the restored Hut 6, among the clatter of restored Enigma replicas and murmuring visitors, Herivel's name finally found its echo. The echoes of Bletchley Park never truly fell silent. Even decades after the war, its ghosts lingered in the hum of computers, the flicker of monitors, and the rhythm of digital code. Because what began there, in wooden huts filled with cigarette smoke, cold tea, and sleepless minds, became the foundation of the modern information age. Yet for years, much of that legacy was misattributed, simplified into myth. Alan Turing became the face of British code-breaking, rightly so. But behind his legend stood an army of minds whose brilliance was buried beneath the Official Secrets Act. Among them were the forgotten names: Mavis Beatty, Margaret Rock, Joan Clark, Peter Twin, and John Herivel, the quiet mathematician whose empathy for the enemy unlocked their machine. In the post-war years, most Bletchley veterans could not speak of their work, not to their families, their universities, or even their fellow servicemen. They returned to ordinary lives carrying extraordinary secrets. Herivel once wrote in his unpublished notes, "The burden of silence is that you begin to believe it was all a dream. You wonder if it ever truly happened. The nights, the codes, the pressure of history on your shoulders." For some, that silence became a kind of grief. Mavis Beatty, who had helped break the Italian naval Enigma before she turned 20, later recalled, "We weren't heroes. We were ghosts working in the shadows. When the war ended, we simply vanished." Their generation built the age of computing, and then faded into the background of the very machines their minds had made possible. In the early 2000s, as Bletchley Park transformed into a museum and heritage site, the movement to document these hidden figures gained momentum. Historians, veterans, and families began coming forward with letters, diaries, and photographs long kept in drawers and attics. One of those discoveries came from Herivel's niece, who donated a small collection of papers to the museum. Inside was a letter written by Alan Turing in 1941. It began, "Dear John, your idea, as simple as it was, may have saved us months of guessing. I only wish we had more of your luck and less of our bureaucracy." That line, humble and human, became part of the museum's permanent exhibition, displayed beside a restored Enigma machine under soft yellow light. Visitors would often pause, reading Turing's handwriting and then Herivel's name. They would ask, "Who was he?" And at last, there was an answer. In 2009, the British government officially recognized the contributions of all Bletchley Park veterans. Each received a commemorative badge engraved with the words, "The Government Code and Cipher School, we also served." John Herivel's was sent to Belfast, to the home where he had lived quietly for over 50 years. He wore it once, to a university ceremony where he spoke only briefly. "I did what anyone would have done. The only difference is that I guessed right." It was the kind of understatement that defined that generation. Men and women who had stared into the machinery of war and refused to be consumed by it. The Herivel Tip, at its heart, wasn't about technology. It was about psychology. He had looked at the enemy and realized that even in the most efficient system, humanity leaves traces: fatigue, laziness, habit, fear. That lesson endures in modern cryptography and cybersecurity. Every firewall, every algorithm, every encryption key ultimately defends against human error as much as external attack. It's why Herivel's notes are studied not just by historians, but by intelligence agencies and computer scientists around the world. His theory that logic and empathy must coexist remains the cornerstone of human-centered analysis. "Every machine hides the man who made it," Herivel once wrote. "If you can understand the man, you can understand the code." When the Bletchley veterans gathered for the last major reunion in 2009, Herivel was there. He was frail, his eyesight failing, but his memory sharp as ever. He listened as one by one his colleagues spoke of the long nights, the fear of failure, the unspoken bond of those who carried the same burden of secrecy. As the speeches ended, he stood and said softly, "It wasn't the machines that won the war. It was the people who trusted each other enough to believe they could." The hall fell silent. In that moment, the old mathematician's words carried the same quiet gravity they had in 1940, when a young man with nothing but intuition dared to imagine the enemy's morning routine, and in doing so, changed the course of history. When John Herivel passed away in 2011, the Times published a short obituary. It read simply, "John William Herivel, mathematician and codebreaker, born 29 August 1918, died 18 January 2011. His idea helped break the Enigma code. But to those who knew, that line meant something vast. The recognition of a mind that had shaped the future and asked for nothing in return." Today, visitors still walk the halls of Bletchley Park, pausing by his display case. They see his notebooks, his old fountain pen, and the faint pencil markings that first outlined the human flaw inside the German machine. The plaques outside read, "They also served." But perhaps the truest memorial to Herivel and his kind is invisible, living quietly in every secure network, every encrypted transmission, every algorithm that protects our world. Because before there were codes and computers, there were people. And before there were machines, there was the human mind. Fragile, flawed, but endlessly brilliant. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the bells of London rang for victory. But not at Bletchley Park. There were no parades here, no champagne, no singing in the streets. The Codebreakers, thousands of men and women who had lived in shadows, were told to pack their belongings and go home. No one was to speak a word of what they had done. Not for a year. Not for 10. For 50. Sarah Langford stood in Hut 6 for the last time. The walls were covered with pinholes where once hundreds of German intercepts had hung. The machines, her beloved bombs, stood silent, cold, their wires disconnected. It felt like a ghost had passed through the place. A senior officer handed her a sealed document. "You will never speak of this work," he said. "Not to your family, not to your friends, not even to your children. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded. Her throat was dry. The man's expression was heavy. Not cruel, but burdened. He too had lived under the same vow. That night, she took the train back to London. The capital was a ruin. Bombed streets, shattered windows, but alive with the joy of peace. Yet she felt nothing. How could she, when she carried the weight of a secret war no one would ever know? For years afterward, she lived quietly. She worked as a librarian, married a schoolteacher, raised 2 sons. Her husband never knew that she had once read the private thoughts of Hitler's generals. Her children never guessed that their mother had helped save millions. Every night she dreamed of endless strings of numbers, of cold rooms filled with the hum of machines and the smell of damp paper. Sometimes she would see old comrades by chance, at a train station or a post office queue. They'd exchange brief glances, a knowing nod, then walk away without a word. Their silence was their bond. In 1974, when the Official Secrets Act restrictions began to ease, the truth finally started to emerge. Journalists wrote of Bletchley Park, of the Enigma machine, of the women who broke Hitler's code. Sarah read the articles with trembling hands, her eyes filled with tears. Not from pride, but from the strange ache of recognition. The world was finally learning what they had done. But for her, the years of silence had already carved deep scars. She was 63 when she was invited back to Bletchley Park for the first time. The estate had become a museum, its once secret huts now preserved for history. She walked through the corridors where she had once sprinted between shifts, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floors. In Hut 6, she found her old desk still there, initials carved faintly into the wood. S.L. A young curator approached her. "Did you work here?" he asked, wide-eyed. Sarah smiled faintly. "Yes," she said after a pause. "A long time ago." He asked what she did, and she looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to answer. "I helped end the war." That night, as she stood outside in the garden, she could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed, the same sound that had carried her to this place decades ago. She thought of Alan Turing, of her friends, of the nights filled with fear and code and brilliance. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of numbers. She dreamed of peace, and in the quiet darkness, it felt like the hum of the bombs, the heartbeat of Bletchley, had finally gone still. Decades after the last code was cracked and the final message decrypted, Bletchley Park was no longer a secret. Tourists wandered through its rooms with cameras, historians spoke of its genius, and the world finally began to understand how close. Britain had once come to the edge of defeat, but for those who had lived it, for Sarah, Langford and the few who still breathed, the recognition came too late to feel like triumph. It felt instead like memory returning from a long, deep sleep. In 1983, Sarah received a letter from a historian writing a book on the Enigma story. He had found her name buried in a declassified personnel list, a line of faded ink that had once been stamped confidential. She stared at the letter for a long time before replying. "Yes," she wrote, "I was there, but what we did was never about glory. It was about duty." When the historian visited, he brought with him photographs, rows of young men and women in uniform smiling in front of the huts. Sarah leaned forward, her finger trembling over a familiar face. Margaret, her closest friend, who had died in a bombing raid in 1944. "She was brilliant," Sarah whispered. "She solved an entire cipher family in one night. The Germans never even knew they'd lost it." Her voice cracked. "And she never lived to see peace." The historian listened quietly. Then Sarah reached into a small box she had kept sealed for 40 years. Inside were the few remnants of her secret life. A ration card stamped BP, a pass marked Hut 6, a photograph of the bomb machine. "We were told to destroy everything," she said. "But I couldn't. These were the proof that we existed." By then, the name Alan Turing was finally becoming known. The mathematician, once persecuted and silenced, now hailed as a visionary. Statues were being built, books were being written. To Sarah it felt right. He had been the heart of it all, the one who saw patterns in chaos when others saw only gibberish. But she also knew the truth few outside Bletchley ever would, that the victory was not his alone. It was hundreds of women like her, linguists, clerks, mathematicians, typists who worked until their hands bled, who saw patterns in the noise and humanity in the code. In the late 1980s, Sarah was invited to a small private ceremony at Bletchley Park. The estate had been restored, its secrets turned into exhibits for the public. She stood alongside a few surviving veterans, now frail and gray, their medals glinting softly in the afternoon sun. As the national anthem played, she felt tears sting her eyes. Around her, the ghosts of the past seemed to whisper. The rattle of typewriters, the hum of the bombs, the soft murmur of tired voices reading endless lines of numbers. When the ceremony ended, she walked alone through the garden, past the pond where ducks once glided under blackout curtains. In her hand, she held a single piece of Enigma ciphertext that had been preserved in the archives, an intercepted message from 1941, once indecipherable, now translated into plain English. All ships retreat. Enemy knows our course, she smiled faintly. That one line, cracked by her section in Hut 6, had saved thousands of lives in the Atlantic. She had never known whose hands had been spared because of it, only that somewhere, someone's sons had come home. At sunset, she left a small bouquet by the steps of Hut 6. No plaque bore her name. No statue would ever show her face. But in that silence, she felt the weight of history ease. The secret she had carried for a lifetime no longer needed to be hidden. As the sky turned crimson over the English countryside, Sarah whispered softly, "We were here. We did our part." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind not just a building of secrets, but the echo of a generation that had changed the course of the world. Without ever asking for anyone to know their names,